I got a short story for you. I was living in a city in the north of West Virginia called Fairmont, but this happened at my buddy's hunting cabin in Berkeley County. Berkeley County is one of the easternmost counties of West Virginia and sits at the top of the Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley is part of the Appalachian Trail. The T-Rail is a hiker's paradise. It goes down the Blue Ridge Mountains. It is a truly beautiful area. My buddy has a hunting cabin that is pretty remote in this area. I believe it was family land, handed down. He rarely goes, and the cabin had not been used at that time for a few seasons. When my buddy suggested that we take a long weekend to be mountain men, what we call hunting, fishing, and roughing it, I was all in. We packed light because the cabin does have some of the necessities, like running water. The trip into the cabin was great. The views are truly unmatched. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon and settled in for the night. Everything in the cabin seemed to be in order as we quickly glanced about. Besides finding a snake in the woodpile, the afternoon was relatively uneventful. We were pretty beat and went to sleep around dark, so it was probably 9 p.m. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, something made a noise outside my room. It startled me awake. It sounded like something had fallen. Knowing that the cabin had not been in use, and most likely wild animals had become comfortable coming close, I thought it was most likely a deer or raccoon. It was probably helping itself to our McDonald's bags we had left on the bench outside the door. I must have drifted off to sleep, because I was then startled awake again around 1:45. This time there was a loud boom. My buddy had woken up too, and he was on the other side of the cabin. Both of us quickly grabbed our guns and a light. We tried at first to peer out the little front window in the cabin, but due to it being small and unclean, it was impossible to really see out. We then decided to creep out and see what had caused the commotion. As we slowly and quietly slid out the front door, we saw that the heavy wood bench that sat out front had been tossed upside down about 5 feet away. The area is known to have bears and wild boar. The bears can be quite large, and the boar are just stupid destructive. Yet not a single creature was in sight. It was late, and I was on edge. We decided it would be best to just hunker down for the night. The original plan was that we would get up super early Friday morning to hunt, but after the night we had, it was decided we would not go out until after daylight. At daylight, we began poking around outside. We did not notice at first, but then we realized there were faint tracks all around the cabin. The tracks were odd. The creature was for sure not a bear or wild boar. This thing had a footspan longer than that of a typical man's. We measured it at about 14 inches long. It favored the outside of its feet, so a width measurement was impossible to get accurately. I wear a size 12 shoe, and it was easily wider and longer. The creature seemed to have toes or something that splayed more like fingers. I could not figure out if it was walking on 2 feet or 4. It seemed to switch back and forth. At this point, I am working on the Google machine. I was trying to determine what types of wildlife are in the area we are in and figure out if we should be more scared than what we were. During my wild Google session, my buddy had decided to start breakfast. He had brought a grill for us to cook on, so he went to the truck to dig it out. This quickly turned into some frantic hollering. During the night, whatever had flipped the bench had obviously helped themselves to most of the supplies in the back of the truck. The grill was still there, most likely due to it not being super portable, but our extra hunting gear had been taken. Our cooler was gone, and so were several of our knives. Luckily, we had brought all of the guns inside when we arrived. We also had begun to entertain the idea that some druggy mountain people had stumbled upon us last night. It didn't exactly explain the bench, but it did the stealing. We then had a decision to make. We could try to salvage what we could and stay till Sunday, the original plan, or we could take off. I was ready to leave but didn't want to admit it. My buddy still wanted to stay and do some exploring. I think he was sore about having been stolen from and was hoping to come across his stuff. After breakfast, we decided to do some scouting. We took off on foot with our hunting rifles. We had probably walked about 15 minutes when we approached the creek that borders one side of his property. We were ready to follow the creek for a bit, when I spotted something orange across the creek. We waded through a narrow part of the channel and found that the orange item was my hunting safety vest. Even while wearing camo, we usually wear something bright to stay safe from a stray bullet being sent by a hunting partner. It looked like it had been dropped. At this point, my buddy wanted to continue in the direction the vest was left, to see if we could find the thieves. I suggested we call the police, but he laughed at the idea and said that the police would never make the trek out this far to recover hunting supplies. He was probably right, but later we learned it was for a different reason. We continued on, and at this point I was spooked. Every time a squirrel scurries by, I am ready to bolt. Then my friend pointed out a cave. Not like the little holes I always imagine caves to be, but a huge open-mouth cave. My buddy is all pointing and trying to whisper that the druggies might be hiding out there. Then something happened. A large creature, hunkered like a bear, moved to the mouth of the cave. It was on all fours, but its back was angled high like a feline. It was covered in shaggy fur like a sheepdog would have. It was brownish, black. I could not see its face, only its back and a little of its side. At this point, the creature slowly started to rise. It kept rising, slowly lifting its large, heavy body. I was a good distance, but it was easily over 7 feet tall. It did not have clothing on, only shaggy hair, fur. I stood completely still, afraid to move or even breathe. The creature stealthily moved into the cave. At this point, I am done. No amount of convincing would have kept me hanging around. I glanced at my buddy and he was the same. As quietly as possible, we moved back toward the creek. We crossed and then ran back to the cabin. Without saying a word, we packed up our stuff and took off. It was probably 10 minutes up the road that we finally began to really speak. We decided to stop by the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office was a laid-back place. Funny enough, it even had coffee and donuts sitting out on the counter when we went in. We asked to speak to someone in private about some items being stolen. I think we were obviously scared of what we would say when we began to speak. The receptionist walked us back to a small office. Sitting at the desk was an officer, and he asked what he could help us with. I finally worked up the nerve and explained that we had been at a hunting cabin on the North Rim, and that we had been woken in the night to some items being stolen from our vehicle. He asked for a more specific location, and when we gave him a closer address, he began to smirk. He asked what we did after the items were stolen, and we described our morning. When I told him about the creature, he did put on a more serious face. In a drawl, he said, "You two are lucky. We have a bandit of sorts on that mountain. Most see evidence of him passing through, but very few have been able to catch a glimpse. Gentlemen, thank you for your time in Berkeley County and have a safe trip home." Needless to say, the cabin has now officially been abandoned. My buddy has not been back, and as far as I know, no one else has. But I know what I saw. There's a giant creature that lives in a cave, not too far from an abandoned hunting cabin. The memories I have of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, well, it was a very strange and scary time. I never used to believe that our dreams meant anything. I always thought people who kept dream diaries or who tried to apply hidden meanings to them were a bit on the crazy side. But I'm not sure how I feel anymore. About 10 years ago, my family was going through a personal crisis. I was about 25 at the time, and my younger brother was utterly possessed by drug addiction. He had been arrested a few times and had even stolen from my parents and other family members. My mother refused to kick him out of the house, but she made him attend a 60-day inpatient rehab in the city. I had a friend who worked there, and she promised to keep an eye on him. The first few weeks were great, and my brother started gaining weight and would even laugh and joke around with us when we went to visit on Sundays. There was still a lot of hurt to mend, but that could wait for the future. We were all feeling hopeful and just wanted my brother to be okay. Right around the 3rd week my brother had been in rehab, I started having a kind of reoccurring dream. A man I have never met nor remember seeing would be walking down the street. He had shoulder-length curly brown hair and gray-green eyes behind a pair of thick rim glasses. His mouth was always in a sort of semi-smile, but not a smirk. Almost like he was completely content with wherever he was in the world. Even though he was only walking, I could never catch up to him. After a while, he would always turn and look at me, and then that's it. I would wake up every time he looked at me. Like I said, I didn't really buy into any of that spiritual crap and just figured he was some guy in a TV show I watched and just can't remember. After about a week of having these dreams, I got a call from my friend down at the rehab. She told me that in the middle of the night, my brother had signed himself out. He wasn't court-ordered, and my parents, against my advice, had left a little cash with him in case he needed toiletries or something. I had a good idea of where he was going. Kensington, North Philadelphia is an incredibly notorious open-air drug market. You can literally buy heroin on the street like it was a hot dog from a street vendor. I considered leaving him to his fate, but he was my brother, and despite how angry and hurt I was, I love him. So I went looking for him. I had a picture of him, but I didn't really think it would be of any use. Still, I tried. I walked around for hours, showing the picture to passerbys and pretty much waiting to get beat up or robbed at any moment. I'm 6'1" and I go to the gym, but I was still way out of my element. I walked for hours and hours. It was getting late, and as desperate as I was, I knew that staying after dark would guarantee trouble. I started heading back towards the bus stop when I thought I recognized someone standing at the end of the street. The man from my dreams. He stared at me for a few seconds with that slight smile on his face, and then turned and walked around the corner. I sprinted to catch up to him, momentarily forgetting about my brother. When I rounded the corner, I saw that he was already at the next block and turning again. There was no way, not even if he ran, that he could have made it that far. I kept running after him, some of the other pedestrians on the sidewalk yelling curses at me. We played that cat-and-mouse game for several blocks, and he turned a few more times. Finally, as I came speeding around another corner, I saw him standing in front of an alleyway. He turned to look at me and then walked down it. I trotted over to the head of the alley and peered down. The alley ended in a dead-end brick wall, and the guy was nowhere to be seen, only a bunch of garbage and a dumpster. That's when I noticed a pair of legs sticking out from behind the dumpster. Thinking it was the guy, I rushed over with balled fist. It was my brother. He was unconscious, a needle sticking out of his arm. I tried to slap him awake, but he wasn't responding. I pulled out my phone and called 911. Due to the sheer number of drug overdoses in the area, there were a lot of emergency response teams nearby. They got there in a few minutes, shot my brother full of Narcan, and rushed him to the hospital. He survived. And not only that, the incident was enough to actually knock some sense into him. He's still clean to this day and owns a successful landscaping business. I wouldn't dream about the man for another 10 years. I became a dad recently to a little baby boy. The pregnancy was rough on my partner, and we had a few scares, but in the end we're blessed with the newest addition to our family. Sleep, when it came, was restless, and over the last 2 weeks I had started dreaming about that guy again. This time he was just standing there, right in front of me, but at a weird angle, almost like I was looking up at him. No matter what I did, I couldn't touch him and would always wake up after a while. I chalked it up to bad sleep, being too preoccupied with my son to give it any real thought. When my son was about 2 months old, my partner was finally starting to feel like her old self again. We had just laid the baby down for a nap, and my partner wanted to go visit her sister a few minutes away before the baby woke up again and was hungry. She deserved a little time for herself, and I wanted to trim some of the hedges out back, which was going to take 20 minutes tops. I had headphones on connected to the baby monitor, as well as an app on my phone that was connected to video. I could see and hear everything in the room. I was outside, my back turned against my house. I was almost done, maybe another 10 minutes, when I pulled out my phone to check on my son. There was someone standing next to his crib, staring right into the baby camera. It was the man, the same man from the day I found my brother. In full panic, I rushed into the house and right to the bedroom. I looked around quickly and couldn't see him anywhere. Our house isn't that big, single-story ranch, and it only took a few seconds to check every other room. I went back into the bedroom to check on the baby and my gut just dropped to the floor. Somehow my little boy had wiggled around in his swaddle, and it had come up higher than it should, covering his mouth and nose. I couldn't see it from the camera angle. I frantically pulled it down to his chin and could see that his face had a slightly bluish tint to it. I pulled him out of the crib and placed him onto the bed while simultaneously calling 911 from my cell phone. The person on the phone walked me through what to do while the paramedics came, but even as I followed her steps, my son's color started to return to normal and he was breathing. The paramedics showed up minutes later and still thought we should take him to the hospital. I went with the van and called my partner to tell her what happened, but I was feeling better now because my son wasn't showing any signs of distress. We got to the hospital, my partner showing up a few minutes later and sat right outside the room while the nurses and a doctor checked him out. The doctor eventually came out and confirmed that he was just fine, and no permanent damage had been done. She did tell us, however, that even a couple of minutes longer without breathing, and the result could have been devastating. I've never been so scared, and I still don't know what to think. When I had this experience, it changed everything about what I thought the wilderness might be. I realized I had no idea of what all existed out there. This took place when I was 13 or 14 years old. I lived in Ohio, and when I was young, my parents would send me out to a camp in the eastern part of the state for a week every summer. It was a sleepaway camp with an outdoor adventure theme. It was everything you'd want in a summer camp, with hiking and archery and group games and campfire sing-alongs and all that good stuff. It had group housing that fell into 3 categories. The first category was log cabins, which were reserved for the older kids. The second category was yurts, which were like large tents with rounded tops. The third category was tree houses, and that's where I was staying. The treehouse was essentially a single-room structure, situated 10 feet above the forest floor on wooden supports, kind of like stilts. It was like the lower half of a typical room and didn't really have walls, except for a 3-foot barrier that prevented people from falling out. This meant the treehouse was open to the elements. But it did have a slanted wooden roof with overhangs that protected us from rain. Since there was a distance of about a quarter mile between each living area, it felt pretty secluded. Our group consisted of a counselor and about 6 kids. I had always had a little insomnia, and on the last night of camp I was having trouble falling asleep. The moon was really bright, and that was keeping me even more awake. The night was pretty peaceful besides the typical sounds you'd expect to hear in the middle of a forest on a summer night. I was just laying there lost in my thoughts. Eventually I realized I was hearing a distinct sound that gradually became more distinguishable from the other noises. At first it just sounded like a faint rustling of leaves, but as the sound grew closer, I could tell that something was moving through the trees. I started listening closer, feeling a little nervous. It was obvious that whatever it was kept moving toward us since the sound was getting progressively louder after a few minutes. It started sounding like the noise was being made by the footsteps of a person's walking pattern rather than an animal, and by then it sounded really close. At that point, I realized it was approaching from the south, which led towards the depths of the woods/lake region instead of from the north, where the outhouse kitchen area was located. That definitely made me think that it wasn't a counselor or someone coming to alert us of something. When I realized that, my curiosity changed to fear. I could tell that whatever it was would soon be reaching the clearing surrounding the treehouse. I tried to roll over as quietly as I could so I could sit up and take a look over the railing. When I sat up, I heard a slight rustling sound coming from my left. The other kids were still asleep, but I saw that the counselor who was sleeping with us in the treehouse was awake. Apparently, he had rolled over in his cot to grab my attention when he saw that I was about to get up. He was still lying down, but he held up his hand to signal me to stop as soon as we made eye contact. I did what he told me and laid back down. I was just holding my breath and listening as hard as I could. The footsteps had stopped, which made me even more nervous since I had no idea where the thing was. I was worried that it was somewhere below us in the treehouse's clearing. Then I heard a branch crack and a strange sound that was like flapping. The counselor got out of his cot as quietly as he could, and I couldn't help myself. I followed him. As soon as we looked through the railing, we saw this bizarre creature swoop out of a tree and land on the ground below us. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen or heard of before. It was tall, dark, and winged with glowing red eyes that shone in the darkness. It was like me and the counselor were just frozen there. And as we were staring down, the creature looked up and locked eyes with me. I don't know how to explain it, but I almost felt as if it had been seeking me out specifically. The creature didn't move, and it was like it was just studying us with this piercing gaze that felt like it went right through us. The silence then was almost deafening, and I was barely breathing, waiting for it to make its next move. And then it spread its wings and took off, soaring up into the high branches and disappearing in the darkness. We were basically just paralyzed with fear and didn't know what to do next. We stayed huddled in the treehouse for the rest of the night. I mean, there was no way we were going to venture anywhere not knowing where that thing had gone. And we didn't want to wake up the others and have a full-blown panic going on. At least it was only a couple hours until sunrise. And when it got light enough and everyone woke up, the counselor just calmly as possible herded us all to where the main camp was and settled us in the dining area. He ordered us to stay put while he went and talked to the camp director. The other kids didn't know what was going on, and I just did not want to talk about it at all. There was such a weird mood in the camp that morning while we waited for our parents to pick us up. It was a complete contrast to the usual last-day shenanigans that would usually be going on. I don't know what the counselors told the parents. I did tell my mom and dad what I had seen. It's hard to know what they really thought. From that day on, I never looked at the woods in the same way again. I had experienced something that hardly anyone would believe, and it really changed me.